Hello everyone, I'm the Saxy Gamer. Today we're here for yet another episode of the Civilization VI Victory Basics series, where today we're going to be going over one of the generally least understood types of victories among beginners, and that is culture victory. So let's begin with perhaps the most important thing for a victory, and that is the win condition that you're trying to achieve, because if you don't know what you're trying to do, then generally it's going to be pretty hard to decide what you should do to get there. So with a culture victory, one of your first goals is going to be to build theater squares to recruit some great people and produce culture. So contrary to, I'm sure, what is popular belief amongst beginners, culture is not actually explicitly the way that you win a culture victory. I know that doesn't really make sense, but what actually is tourism, and one of the ways to earn tourism early on in the game is to build theater squares and recruit great writers, artists, and musicians that will produce great works that produce tourism. Culture is also very helpful because it helps you get ahead in the civic tree, which unlocks some useful policies that you can use to help you win your victory, and it also unlocks some wonders and things like that that are also very useful whenever you are getting later on into the game. I should also mention that during this portion of the game, which is most of the game, you should be trying to build wonders whenever possible, really just any one that you can get your hands on. Wonders are not explicitly crucial for winning a culture victory because they do provide tourism, but they don't provide a ton in comparison to some other sources that we'll talk about. But either way, just, stacking up a little bit throughout the entire game is obviously going to accumulate after a while, so you should be trying to build wonders whenever you can. Once you progress through the game a little bit and you start getting towards the modern era, then your goal changes a little bit, and now you want to generate tourism to attract tourists from other civilizations, because this is eventually what will win you the game. So whenever you reach the modern era and just anywhere around that, your goal becomes to produce national parks, seaside resorts, and rock bands that will produce large amounts of tourism that will help you win the game. The end goal of producing tourists, and the thing that will actually win you the game, is whenever you attract more tourists than the highest number of domestic tourists owned by another player. If you're confused by what domestic tourists are, you can check out my Culture Victory in-depth video, which goes into quite a bit of detail on what these are and how they are generated, but the basic gist of it is that all players, yourself included, will generate domestic tourists throughout the game as you generate culture. So therefore, in order to win a culture victory, you have to be generating more tourism than the next highest player is generating culture. Throughout the game, you can check your progress towards a culture victory in the World Rankings menu under Culture, and you can see the number of domestic tourists that is owned by each civilization, as well as the number of visitors that you have from each individual's civilization, and then your total number of visiting tourists out of the goal that will attain you a culture victory. So, as you can see here, all of the domestic tourist counts are listed on the left, but the only one that actually matters is the one that is the highest. So in this instance that I'm looking at here, you can see that Teddy Roosevelt has the highest number at 254 domestic tourists, and I need 255 visiting tourists in order to win the game. So now with our goals in mind, let's go ahead and discuss some of the best leaders for culture victory. Some of these will be geared towards beginners, and some of them are geared towards more advanced players, but all of these leaders that I'm going to talk about here are very good at winning a culture victory. So first up here we have Cyrus, who is probably one of the best culture victory leaders in the game. So Cyrus is unique because he's one of the leaders that is able to make use of the fact that it's useful to have a lot of land in Civ 6 because he has a very strong militaristic early game, and then he also has a really strong tile improvement, the Pairi da Eza, that will allow him to produce extra appeal on tiles, which will boost the tourism from things like seaside resorts and national parks, which we'll talk about later on. Cyrus is definitely a little bit of a more complex leader, and I would not recommend him for beginners of culture victory. Next up, we have Peter of Russia. Peter is useful for culture victory because his lava will produce a lot of cultural great people, such as great writers, artists, and musicians, and therefore it is very easy to get a lot of great works that will produce both culture and tourism. Peter is fairly straightforward because really all you have to do is put down his lava to generate those great people, so for that reason I would say that he is decent for beginners. Coupe is another really good beginner culture victory civ just because he is able to get a lot of tourism kind of passively. So Coupe gets bonuses on a lot of his tile yields, including culture, and then later on in the game, all the tiles that produce culture will also produce tourism, so Coupe just naturally kind of gets a lot of tourism from his land without you even having to do anything with it. So for that reason, I would recommend Coupe. He's very strong because he gets a lot of both culture and faith, which are both useful, and then he just kind of gets those passively throughout the game, so it's very easy for a beginner to excel with Coupe. Up next, we have the two Greek civs. Both Gorgo and Pericles are strong leaders for culture victory. They are both capable of generating insane amounts of culture. They are not exactly the best at producing extra tourism, but even so, their Acropolis district is really strong in getting adjacency bonuses, and it's very easy compared to a theater square in order to get adjacency bonuses on the Acropolis. Pericles is also unique because he gains a percentage-based boost from city-states whenever he is the suzerain of them, which can give you huge amounts of culture throughout the game. Gorgo is also very strong, and she's a little bit more militaristically focused, like Cyrus, so I would say Pericles is better for newer players who are not so comfortable with domination, but Gorgo is also very good and something that you should utilize if you're becoming more familiar with combat and are utilizing an early game militaristic power spike to grab a lot of land. And lastly, we have Teddy, who I would more so recommend for more advanced players, just because Teddy is able to build the film studio later on in the game, which will double the tourism output from his cities. He also does get some bonuses to his national parks, and therefore it is very easy to get a ton of tourism on Teddy. There are very few leaders in the game that will have something as good as literally doubling their wind condition yield, so Teddy doubles tourism, obviously. It does require pretty good use of national parks, though, and seaside resorts, so for that reason, I would say he's a little bit more on the advanced player side, because he also doesn't get really good cultural yield bonuses or anything of that sort throughout the game, so you should at least know what you're doing a little bit before you try and play culture on Teddy. Now let's move on and talk about what you're going to be doing throughout a large portion of the game, and let's start with settling and what type of land you should be looking to get in a game. So one of the things that I look for whenever I'm playing a culture victory is flatland coast tiles, because those are tiles that will be valid for seaside resorts, which are easily one of the ways to get a ton of tourism. Another thing that can be useful is mountain tiles, because they provide extra appeal to the surrounding tiles, which makes it easy to produce national parks on them, and you can also put ski resorts on them later on in the game. As is the case with pretty much every single victory type in Civ 6, it is pretty much always better to have a lot of cities and a lot of land, so I would suggest that you settle as many cities as you can. With regards to playing militaristically and attacking your nearest neighbors, I think it can be a good idea to do so with Culture Victory, but you do have to be a little bit careful about it. So with Culture Victory, you do get tourism yield bonuses from having trade routes and open borders with other civilizations, so later on in the game when your tourism yield starts to increase a lot, you generally want to be friendly with people so that way you can have those trade routes and open borders. Early on, though, I would suggest attacking your nearest neighbor, because more land will give you more spots for seaside resorts, national parks, and ski resorts, all which lead to more tourism. I should note that you definitely should not totally eliminate someone from the game whenever you are going for a culture victory. The reason for this is because you attract your visiting tourists from your opponent's pool of domestic tourists. If you totally remove someone from the game, then it is one less pool of domestic tourists that you can attract visitors from, and thus it becomes harder to overcome the highest player's amount of domestic tourism. Instead, you should leave them with 1 or 2 cities, so that way they are in the game and, still hanging on, but you still get to use most of their land, and they are pretty much crippled and will not be a threat for the rest of the game. As I mentioned before, whenever you are pre-modern era, you should be placing down theater squares in order to generate culture that will propel you ahead in the civic tree and also attract some great writers and artists and musicians and things of that sort for you to generate a little bit of extra culture and tourism from. Another thing that you should do throughout the game is place down a few holy sites, because you are going to need a lot of faith in the late game whenever you want to buy rock bands and naturalists. It is not crucial that you get a religion, and I would generally recommend not doing so because it really slows down your early game, but instead you should just be placing down holy sites wherever you have decent adjacency bonuses, so that way you can slowly accumulate your faith throughout the game. As I mentioned before, you should be building wonders whenever possible, but it's not crucial to build a lot of wonders. It's more so just a convenience thing, and if you have the resources to be able to do so. There are, however, a few key wonders that are very useful for Culture Victory and that I would highly recommend you build, and they are the Eiffel Tower, because it provides appeal to all of the tiles in your empire, which makes it really easy to place down national parks and seaside resorts. There's also Cristo Redentor, which will double the tourism that you produce from your seaside resorts, which can give you a huge boost if you have a lot of them. And there's also the Golden Gate Bridge, which will give you a big boost to the appeal of the tiles in a single city, as well as some boost to your national parks in that city as well, which can be extremely helpful. I would recommend going for any of these wonders in pretty much every single cultural game that you're going for, but it's not necessarily an immediate win-lose if you don't get them. So now let's move on to the ever so popular modern era where a lot of the things for culture victory will be taking place, and let's talk about what you need to do in order to generate a lot of tourism. So a big thing that is behind a lot of the effectiveness of seaside resorts and national parks that are crucial towards generating tourism is appeal. Appeal is a characteristic of every single tile in Civ 6, and you could take a look at it by either looking at the appeal lens or just by hovering your cursor over the tile to pull up the little tooltip that will tell you what the appeal is on a tile. In the case of both national parks and seaside resorts, the amount of tourism that they produce is directly related to the amount of appeal that is on the tile. Tiles will lose appeal by having effectively ugly things that are next to them, such as rainforests, mines, or industrial zones, and they will gain appeal through having pretty things next to them, such as holy sites or woods. One of the most useful things that you can do in the later game in order to prepare to build your seaside resorts and national parks is to identify the spots where you want to build them and then chop the rainforests that are nearby, or remove the mines that are nearby in order to improve the appeal on the tile. So you can see here that this tile right now that I'm looking at has 3 appeal, but whenever I chop the rainforest, this goes up to 4. Whenever you research the Conservation Civic, it will allow you to plant woods, and I would suggest that you do that near all of these locations that you want to put your seaside resorts and national parks, because once you plant woods, now you can see that the appeal has gone up to 5. This alone is one of the most important things towards making a culture victory game successful, because being able to place down more of these seaside resorts and national parks will give you a huge improvement to your tourism. You can also improve the national parks or seaside resorts that are already placed by doing this as well, if there are rainforests or mines nearby that are able to be removed, and if there are spots where you can plant more woods. I should also mention that throughout the game, you probably should not be chopping woods tiles, because whenever you have natural woods that have spawned since the beginning of the game, they will provide 2 appeal to all the surrounding tiles, but the ones that you plant artificially will only provide 1. So as we've kind of discussed them, we've kind of touched on seaside resorts already, but seaside resorts are a tile improvement that is unlocked with the radio technology, and these improvements can be placed on flatland tiles that are along the coast. They have to be either plains, grassland, or desert, and they will provide tourism equal to the appeal of the tile that they are placed on. National parks are a little bit more complex than the seaside resorts, but they are equally as useful, if not even maybe a little bit more useful. And to place down a national park, all that you have to do first is recruit a naturalist, which you can buy in a city with faith, and this is the reason why you need to stockpile faith throughout the game, because they are fairly expensive. And from there, you can place your national parks on diamonds of 4 tiles that meet a certain number of requirements. So for 1, all the tiles must be on land. The tiles also must be natural wonders, mountains, or any tile that has an appeal of charming or better. So charming is 2 to 3 appeal. The 4 tiles must also be owned by the same city. So if you're wondering why maybe you're meeting those requirements but things still aren't working, check to make sure that you have the cities that those 4 tiles are all owned by the same city, and swap tiles around if you have to. They also do have to be in the vertical diamond shape that I had mentioned, which I think it's a little goofy that there still isn't the availability to put them in like a horizontal diamond, but it's what we have to work with. And all of the tiles that are in the national park cannot have a district or tile improvement on them. You can also check the tourism that you are producing from each of these improvements by activating the tourism lens and hovering over any of the improvements that you are wanting to look at. There are still 2 more things that you can use in the late game to produce tourism, and they are ski resorts and rock bands. So ski resorts are a unique tile improvement that is unlocked with the Professional Sports Civic. You can just put a builder next to a mountain tile and then produce a ski resort on that tile, and it will provide tourism equal to the mountain's appeal, which I believe is locked at 4. Rock bands are another unit that you can purchase with faith, so yet again another reason to be stockpiling faith throughout the game, and they are a little bit more complicated to use, but they are also extremely strong. So you can send your rock bands to do performances on enemy districts and wonders, and then they will produce tourism based on the quality of their performance, which is semi-random. I would recommend that you go and perform on wonders because they do have the highest chance of success and generally generate the most tourism, which is usually around a few thousand, which can be multiple turns of, if you were just trying to passively generate tourism. As I had mentioned, performing on wonders is the most effective thing to do because it gives you the highest tourism output and also has the lowest chance of losing the rock band to a failed performance. The amount of tourism that you could get from rock bands if you learn to utilize them effectively is absolutely insane. You can see here that at one point I had generated 45,000 tourism from a single rock band performance, which is ridiculous in the grand scheme of things, and the use of rock bands can make you win a culture victory extremely, extremely fast. So those have been the basics behind the culture victory. In a little synopsis here, what you want to do is throughout the game be producing theater squares and holy sites to get up your yields of culture and faith. This will then allow you in the modern era to put down a lot of seaside resorts, national parks, ski resorts, and purchase a lot of rock bands to generate large amounts of tourism. Always be cognizant of what the appeal is on your tiles because that will directly affect the amount of tourism that you get from any of those things, and make sure that you are planting woods and removing rainforests and mines so that way you're able to get higher appeal on your tiles. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in the comment section below, and if you would like to support the channel, feel free to check out the join button and become a member to support the channel on a monthly basis. Thank you everyone for watching. I have been the Saxy Gamer. If you enjoyed the video, feel free to like. If not, feel free to dislike. If you're looking for some more Civilization VI content, feel free to subscribe. Thank you for watching, and goodbye.